Hi, and welcome to Sport Profs, or I guess SportTokz or Sport Profs. So there you go for blowing the lead there. But Dan Berlin here, the coach, joined by my fellow colleague, senior writer with Sportsnet.ca, David Singh. And we have a very, very special guest today here on Office Hours, none other than Thomas Drance. Thomas, welcome to the program, if you will.
Dan, thanks for having me. David, you as well. Good to be here with you guys.
Yeah, listen, I'd like to give a little bit of a background because right now you're a senior writer for The Athletic covering the Vancouver Canucks. And listen, you've had a long and storied career to this point, when you think about it, 10 years plus of hockey media experience. And what's interesting too is your path not necessarily being linear because you are one of the true well, I think you stand out because you've been able to sort of play on both sides. Here you are as a senior writer, but you've also lived in the media relations side, which is our topic for this week for our students, where you've been the vice president of public relations and communications for none other than the Florida Panthers. You spent a few years down south where I guess you could say Trump won Florida, but back then it's hard to say who was in charge. Nonetheless, we're fascinated to get to hear some of your stories, to hear how the other side lives from both perspectives. And again, welcome to the program.
Thanks for the introduction. I did spend 2.5 years or roughly 3 years in Trump's America, and all I've got to say about it is that the weather was fabulous. We enjoyed our time in Florida, and obviously working for the Panthers was an awesome experience and, a once-in-a-lifetime challenge. My route through sports media has been pretty distinct. I think you could probably fairly describe it as eccentric. I started I was a mailroom clerk, and I started a parody Twitter account imitating a obscure Russian-born Canucks fourth liner named Artem Chubarov on a nascent social media platform called Twitter back in 2008 when, presidents didn't even have the thing. And it sort of just snowballed. I ended up with a few thousand followers, and that became a marketing job in social media, like a social media marketing job back when it was the Wild West and no one really knew how to measure value. And, I don't want to say it was a grifter's world at the time, but it was certainly a new and emerging medium, and one that we sort of it was an interesting experience and taught me an awful lot and gave me a totally different type of skill set. I then ended up working for The Score, working for Sportsnet, and then ultimately got hired in the fall of 2016 to go work for the Florida Panthers, and spent 3 years there as the VP of Public Relations and Communications, and that was an unbelievable experience. I'll describe it at length, I'm sure, as we go here. But the education that I got in that role, what I learned, some of the transferable skills that you learn as a journalist that then applied to PR and then sort of were honed further and made me a better, I think I was a better PR guy because of my journalism background. And I think I'm a better journalist now having been a PR guy. So it's a sort of odd feedback loop where, I was well positioned to anticipate stories because of my ability to write them previously. And now on the other side, I think I'm better calibrated, especially when I build relationships and make asks of the organization that I cover, because I have experience handling those issues on the other end. I also think I'm better at anticipating storylines because I kind of know what it looks like between the margins when, people are trying to fudge things or hide things or sort of what it looks like when a hockey team does X, Y, Z. So that's sort of my route. It's been an interesting adventure. And then coming back to Vancouver, I actually just finished my first year, but I've actually been with The Athletic for 14 months now. The league year was long. It included a 66-day stint in Edmonton, where I covered NHL return to play in the bubble. It was just a year unlike anything else that I've ever experienced and hopefully will ever experience again. But it was extremely challenging and extremely gratifying, and the response in the Vancouver market's been great. So excited for some downtime and excited for some certainty and to get back to hockey. But that's sort of my story in a nutshell, and I look forward to sort of getting into the media relations side of it a little bit deeper as we go.
You know, Thomas, there's so much great stuff, but just David, before you jump in, I mean, I think you really isolated this idea of transferable skills. And I always say, like, as a journalist, you know, in many cases, whether you come out of a journalism school or the RTA School of Media, you end up becoming incredibly resourceful. Like at the end of the day, you got to figure things out. You got to meet your deadlines. What do you sort of look at as a journalist as your top three skills that transfer to just whether it be your day-to-day life, how it helped you in media relations, or just how you were able to be dropped into any problem and figure your way out of it?
Yeah, I think well, there's three. There's three that I'll hit really quickly. The first is there is a commonality in terms of being support staff for an NHL team and a media officer for an NHL club and being a journalist, which is that you are never on your own schedule, right? You are, as a journalist, in the service of the story. And if the story breaks at 7 o'clock on a Friday night, like that's what you're doing that evening. You know, that's beyond your control, but that's what sometimes running the story down requires. And the same thing applies when you're a PR executive. You know, I have this memory of being at dinner and my wife's family was down visiting us, and we went to this nice restaurant in Miami, and it was the night of the Manchester bombing. Do you guys remember the concert? I think it was Selena Gomez.
Ariana Grande, or yes,
Ariana Grande. That's right.
yeah.
My wife just yelled from the other room to tell me it was Ariana Grande. But that happened that night, and you know, you don't think about it because you think, well, he worked for an NHL team, but the NHL team has a building and there's concerts at the building, and we had 3 concerts over the next 2 weeks that, you know, we needed to reassure ticket buyers and people who are coming that safety protocols were being followed and on, right? So I get a call during that dinner and it's like, stop, drop, take care of the problem, right? Tons of outgoing communications, servicing media in our area that wanted to localize the story. And that's not hockey media. That's, you know, the broadcast television news side. It's just a new challenge every day, and you kind of can't anticipate it. You just have to be flexible and ready to go. And I think both roles require that and require a level of work ethic and sacrifice that goes well beyond like a 9 to 5. So that's sort of one thing that stands out to me right off the top. The other sort of transferable skill that I'd point to is, as a journalist, you troll around and try to find something interesting, try to find stories, try to find hooks that will, in my case now, behind a paywall at The Athletic, cause people to pay and sign up, but, you know, cause people to read, right? Service your, whatever your medium is, get eyeballs on your content for the service of advertisers and in other sort of realms of journalistic work. And when you're a PR person, when you're in media relations, I think it's actually pretty similar in that when you're doing your job really well, you're looking at your own organization, right? You're looking at your own club or your own organization that you're serving. You know, it could be an individual. You could be working for, you could be working for one person, or you could be working for an NHL team, or you could be working for a bank. But you're always sort of looking around at the organization and identifying stories, things that you guys are already doing that could be hooks that serve your organization's goals. So in an NHL PR capacity, it might be, you know, a player has an interest, right? Like it could be as simple as a player likes this weird thing that could help you, you know, reach a market of like NASCAR fans, you know, like, or a different market segment within your community that maybe wouldn't be exposed to your brand otherwise. But it also could be, you know, figuring out that you've got someone who's been with the organization for 10 years and now works in a hockey operations role, but started as a sales intern. And that might be a story that you can apply to your HR department's efforts to reach out and attract staffers, right? Like there's stories everywhere in an organization. Every person has something that might actually be of value if you look at it, frame it the right way, and just sort of tilt the angle just right so that it might be of interest to a local journalist or to your own in-house content team. And then that's the sort of final thing that I'd say. And I want to say this in a way that doesn't get anyone's back up about, you know, the tough realities that we're all facing in the media industry. But I do think there's a blurring line between media relations and content production. And from the content production side, from the editorial operations side, I know that this is a tough one to get into because it's always seen as a threat, but I don't mean it that way. I mean it more in that as media companies scrape for survival, right? We're dealing with a world that has fewer resources committed to digging and finding those stories, and even just sending a camera if you're a broadcast television news outlet, or assigning a feature writer to do, you know, the kinds of great stories that David would write, for example, right? Or, you know, even having a full-time beat. When I was with the Panthers, in my very first year with the club, both the Sun Sentinel and the Miami Herald laid off their Panthers beat writers in the same month. And we had to do a quick pivot where we brought in our own in-house beat writer and, you know, set it up so that he didn't report to me, even though I handled the digital, my department handled digital communications, including the Twitter account, including the website, but to make sure that he had some veneer of editorial independence, and in fact had real editorial independence. He couldn't report to me. I had to be able to call him and chew him out when he wrote something I didn't like. Like, that was a really important thing to have, because we needed not positive coverage, we needed coverage. And sometimes negative coverage is the most interesting to read. So, you know, being flexible within that, understanding that you are, as a media relations officer for any organization, also producing content, whether you're in fact writing it or whether you in fact control the keys of that content production, you are contributing to your organization's production of content, both owned and earned, and need to be very careful, I think, or not careful, but I think disciplined and proactive about telling your own story too, and keeping that in mind as a media relations officer, that servicing your own channels is vitally important in a world where media companies themselves have fewer resources to dedicate to a variety of organizations, but especially a hockey team in South Florida.
Thomas, you talked about skills. I'm curious about how personality fits in. Like, in your experience, do you have to have a certain temperament to thrive in communications versus journalism?
I think it helps. I definitely think the best PR people, and this would not apply to me, I just want to be very clear, have a Iceman sort of way about them, right? Because you are a referee, especially in markets like Toronto and Vancouver, for example, where you're, you know, more of a traditional issues manager, right? An issues manager and a referee, and making sure you're servicing the rights holder, and making sure you're servicing the rights holder in a way that still grants a reasonable access, a level of access to your non-partner sort of media entities that cover you, and, you know, dealing with the egos of all media people. Like, that's, you know, that, and we all know what we're like, right? Like, that it helps, I think, to be a slightly more removed personality in my experience. Now, that was not who I am, and I don't think that hurt me necessarily. I just notice that there's a commonality that a lot of the best NHL PR people anyway seem to have, that I certainly didn't. And I don't think that was a disadvantage. I just think it was distinct. And, you know, I think overall it's about like, in terms of personality, in terms of what you need, I just think being able to read people, being able to make the people you're working with, athletes, spokespersons for your organizations, making them feel comfortable going into uncomfortable situations, having them trust you so that you can push them to do different things. Like, that's, I think at the end of the day, on both sides of the aisle, whether you're a journalist or whether you're a media relations person, I think it's about those people skills, and it's about building that trust. You know, whether it's with your subjects or with the people you're advising, because without that, I just think you're dead in the water in both camps.
Hey, I'd love to hear, sorry, just an example where maybe you took a member of the Panthers back then and you pushed them to do some things. Now, you were there when Yager was there, if I'm not mistaken.
I was there when Yager was
Well,
there,
you know,
and
maybe
he was
there's
his own PR guy.
yeah.
Jaromir
I was
Yager
gonna
is
say
his own
maybe
PR
there's a
guy. He
story
didn't need
there.
me.
Yeah.
He didn't need me. Like, if he wanted to end a scrum, he'd make a joke and walk away. Like, he'd just be like, "Oh, fine, I'll give you one good quote," and then walk away. And if he didn't want to talk, he wouldn't talk. Yager was like super low maintenance. The thing with Yager was that everyone wanted like autographs, and like the demands on Yager toward the end of his career, when he became a living legend, right, were so high that it was really just about managing that and sort of picking your spots when you knew he was in a good mood so that you could get him to work with you. And sort of learning how to deal with him. Like, Yager was the most interesting guy I worked with, because I had to prove to him basically that I could operate on Yager time, what I called Yager time, which was slow. Like, he was always working out, right? He ended practice, and most guys are, showered within half an hour, right? They've done their media obligations, they've got a sweat in, they've showered, and then they're lounging, hanging out. Like, Yager's like a 4-hour, like squeezing media into that was tough. So once I convinced him that I could operate on his time frame and set things up in a way that worked for him, and once he trusted me to operate in that time frame, he was actually really easy to deal with. But it took me a little bit of time to show him that. There's definitely like a lion tamer element to the job, especially in a hockey locker room, right? Like, there's certain battles you can't lose. Like, there's certain things you can't grant. There's times where you have to be on the, not on the team, but one of the team in terms of protecting guys. And then there's times where you can't protect a guy because, doing so would show the rest of the group that their media obligations don't matter, right? So it's sort of an interesting dynamic, and one that I think is unique to hockey PR and sports PR in general, as opposed to media relations more widely. But yeah, I mean, there's moments where that comes into play for sure, and where you have to be careful about navigating it.
I think that's just a fascinating story, Dave. Thanks for sharing that, because it gives a little glimpse to this, how you do read people, and how you ultimately have to play both sides, and you're sort of towing that line. Like, trust is about honesty. You can't pull fast ones on people. You have to try to be all things to all people all the time, and that can often be, well, I don't have to tell you, but that could be one of the great challenges of the gig, right?
There's
David.
no question. And sometimes too, like, once that, and this applies to a wider point that I'd love to actually get into, because this is sort of one of my core concepts that I'd love to discuss. But I think the fact is when it comes to trust, once it's broken, you're behind the 8 ball. Like, you're never getting back. And, it can be unintentional. Like, I've had media relationships where that trust got broken, not intentionally, but because I just wasn't as clear about timelines as I could have been, or because I was not playing both sides, but because I was trying to do the referee thing, and a reporter interpreted it as me operating in bad faith. Like, there have been moments where you make honest mistakes, but that trust is never coming back the way it is with the people for whom that never occurs. You know what I'm saying? Like, in my experience anyway, the work that you have to put in to rebuild that trust, in terms of your reputation with various media members, is tenfold more difficult than the work maintaining it in the first place. And I think this speaks to a sort of wider theory that I have about media relations that I think is useful, and that I just want to communicate really quickly, which is that in an organization that has bad PR, right, you as a media relations person will be the last person to touch an item, whether it's an announcement, whether it's an initiative, whether it's a problem, before it goes out to the public. And at that point, you can frame things and you can write a nice sentence, but you're dead in the water. Like, you're already hosed if that happens. The way to avoid controversy at the end of the day is not to, flick a magic wand or come up with a great media management strategy, or manage the heck out of a crisis, or pull some rabbit out of a hat like Aaron Sorkin television series style. It's to advocate internally in all matters for doing things the right way, right? For being accountable, for, investigating things that go poorly, for making sure your story's buttoned up. Like, it's being part of the decision-making process all along. So in a good organization, like in an organization with good PR, a PR or communications official is hand in hand with executive leadership on everything. so that they're able to anticipate and advocate for the right way to go about their business. Because that's where you can nip problems in the bud. And that's where, should you ever get a call from a media member asking like, what happened here? You don't ever have to say, let me get back to you. Like, and you know what the story is because you've been part of making it. And because it's been done the right way because of how you advocated for it internally. If you want to avoid taking that punch, like if you want to help your organization avoid taking the punch they can't take, like that glass jaw punch, it's crucial for any good media relations executive to be hand and fist with the executive leadership that they're working with, or the talent, the athletes, the whomever is at the top of the ladder. Like, it's really important that you're a partner with them in decision making if you're going to get the best outcomes.
I want to take it back to what you said a few minutes ago about NHL PR people having an Iceman type personality. And I just want to share, the first time I met you in person was on the Vancouver Canucks beat when I went down there for a story. And I remember just observing from afar, because as a feature writer, parachuting into a new situation, you don't want to be seen too much, especially when you're trying to hide a story, which is what I was trying to do. And
I was worried that you were working on it. So I came over and started pumping you to see if you were working on what I was scared you were working on.
Yeah.
And you completely fibbed to me. And I had a false sense of calm, and then you completely ruined the day for me in early January when you beat me to a tremendous story. One of the best pieces written about the Canucks of the past season was written by David Singh, and I'm still mad about it. But in a way where I can also admire
How'd
the
you
work.
ever rebuild that trust so quickly? It must be 10 times as hard, I guess.
Well, no, it's professional jealousy or the gamesmanship of being like, should I be worried here? That's for me, that's not personal. That's just, I'm a competitive guy. But you always appreciate good work when you see it. So there was zero enmity there, so much as just like, I saw it and I cursed loudly and I moved on with my day eventually.
No, but I'm glad you brought up that we spoke, because I saw you from afar and I noticed like immediately you were the kind of like the more gregarious of any member of the Vancouver Canucks beat. And we did have that conversation, and you very kindly came up to me and recommended people for me to speak to. The reason I bring that up is because as a reporter, technically, first of all, I knew that you were a PR guy for the Panthers in the past. And I thought to myself, how can this guy be a PR guy? Because he's such a nice person. And he's so happy and like jovial. It doesn't vibe with what I know of PR people and what I've experienced with PR people in my mind. So that's a testament to your personality. But the Canucks beat is rather competitive in that there's a lot of different outlets competing, against each other, right?
Yeah.
I know of the great wars that TSN and Sportsnet have in terms of radio wars in Vancouver.
It is a bitterly contested battleground.
Yeah, and so working for The Athletic, as a journalist, I'm curious to know how you've taken your knowledge of how the inside of an organization works from a PR perspective. And are there any examples of you maybe applying that knowledge to get a certain story for The Athletic, or to, do your job as a journalist in that regard, that maybe you would not have done 10 years ago prior to working for the Panthers?
Yeah, I'm gonna squirrel this just a little bit, because I think the thing that I took from my Panthers experience that I think played out the most in terms of informing how I covered the Canucks this past season was more about an understanding of how to go to the team with things that worked for them and that almost were like event-based. And that's such a crucial part of The Athletic, and a distinct part of The Athletic, which is that stunt. Like, it's like stunt content. You know what I mean? It's not enough for me to have the quickest or best version of a story. I also need to have the story that's the most different, right? Like, it needs to be the most different if it's going to cause people to be willing to pay for it or retain the subscribers that we have. And in thinking through that and in thinking through my first season back on the beat, like this was the Canucks' 50th anniversary season. And I think because I'd worked on and actually sort of QB'd the Panthers' 25th anniversary season, I had some pretty concrete notions of the types of content that would work with what the team had already scheduled, right? And because of that, like the Canucks named Bo Horvat their captain at the home opener. And I got like former Canucks captain Marcus Naslund to write an open letter to him of advice on how to be captain.
Yeah.
The day that Alex Burrows' number was retired at Rogers Arena, I dropped a 5,000 word oral history of the Dragon Slayer goal, which is, Alex Burrows' signature Canucks moment and probably the most famous goal in Canucks history. Mm-hmm. On the day the Sedin twins retired had their numbers retired, I managed to twist the organization's arm to set me up for like an hour-long video session where I had, two of the most unique players and the most cerebral players in the history of the sport sort of break down 10 of their greatest shifts at like great length with me. So I was able to build like event-based content programming around things that they were doing and get unprecedented access because I sort of knew that it would work for them and make sense for them. And I think a lot of that approach, a lot of that ideation sort of heft came from my experience trying to promote my own events back when I was with the Panthers. And then in terms of the other side of it, I think honestly, it's almost like a day-to-day thing. It's a really strange dynamic because, it's more about, as a PR guy, and I traveled with the team all the time. Like I did 82 games a year. I was often with the coaching staff. Like I was sort of embedded with that. So I sort of have a really good sense for like what it means at practice when a guy leaves, or like what a bag packed in the room means, or how things are announced, just like the rhythm of how things work. Like I think that I'm able to see it in a different way because I'm used to coming in the morning, going to talk to the coach, making sure there were no surprises in my life, right? Trying to figure out like what will the media see and when, what do I need to be ahead of in terms of my announcement schedule? Like I had a really good sense of that just because I'd done it as a matter of routine with the Panthers. And I think that's an edge for me in day-to-day coverage just because I'm so used to it. And I think I have a perspective, having seen it from the inside and having been forced to anticipate my own organization's actions, that I'm really well able to anticipate Vancouver's from the outside now. So that's sort of the main thing that I think, like, it's not a big sort of scoop that came to me. I think it's just day to day. I understand how a hockey team functions from the inside, and that makes me better at reporting on it from the outside.
Pretty fascinating. And, you talk about that kind of access that you've enjoyed based on, sort of understanding how the other side works, right? And that's positioned you really well. Things have changed a lot since then, right? Like, to say the least. You mentioned 66 days in the bubble in Edmonton and covering it with minimal access and Zoom chats and so on. Maybe you could, we had a chance to talk to Daniel Nugent-Bowman on this program on Office Hours a little earlier. He talked a little bit about lack of access. Would love to just kind of look through your lens and see both, trying to do your job with one hand tied behind your back, so to speak, and also kind of where do you see this going with access?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect we're never coming all the way back, to be totally honest with you. The experience that David and I had at that Canucks, morning skate in December, I don't think we're ever coming all the way back in terms of that level of media in the room every day, multiple times a day on a game day types of access. I just think that players and coaches have enjoyed it too much to not have that. And I think too that the league, the NHL in particular, has structured their bubble in such a way that it was limited. And then once they'd structured their bubble like that, really leaned into it, right? Like they leaned into no injury updates, no one-on-ones. There was almost no human storytelling from the 2020 Stanley Cup playoffs. Like, it was wild. In my entire time in the bubble, through official channels, I had exactly zero one-on-one requests granted by either the NHL or a single NHL PR team. Everything I got through pre-existing relationships or through player agents, or like I worked for it all myself. And I think players loved it. I think coaches loved it. And I think it's going to be really hard to put that genie back in the bottle, even when there's no health excuse for it. Now, I'm not saying we're going to never be in the locker room again. I'm sure practice days and other things, but a game day availability where it's at a podium, maybe stuff like that, maybe one-on-ones granted on request, but I don't think we're ever going all the way back on the other side of this pandemic. That's my personal opinion, just based on my conversations with people I know around the league. It just seems to me like something that, like income taxes in the world wars, right? Like it's an excuse to do something that I think a lot of people around the league want anyway, clearly. And that's just sort of my view of it. Now, that's a pessimistic view, and hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong, because
and part of what contributes to it, Thomas, is, who needs who more? So if the NHL feels like they've got the upper hand, they're like, hey, we can limit this. If their day comes where they're like, we need you to tell stories about us, please come back, then we're going to see access potentially open up.
Well, yeah, and I mean, the good thing is that media access and broadcast policies have the force of CBA. Like, you can fine a general manager, technically, for failing to comply with media access policies. Like, that exists as an arrow in the NHL's quiver. So, it's been a top-down mandate to teams that the NHL media access functions the way it does. And that's another sort of side of the PR role, is that you do a compliance officer sort of thing, right? And regularly remind players too. Like, there are players will try to hide places. They'll try to hide in a medical room or what have you. And it's like, you can't. But force of CBA indicates, like, it's even down to what types of treatment are acceptable excuses to not do media after games or after practices. Like, it is, very much prescribed top down. So hopefully the NHL will insist on it and insist on, servicing the overall. But I just think that there's going to be some compromises on the other side of it now that we've lived through this experience. In terms of the lack of access, and this is going to be more my media hat than my PR guy hat, really quickly. But I got to the bubble and I had zero access, and it was a challenge. But I found something that I could get that no one else could, and it was honestly the swear words on the ice. Like, I just spent an entire summer transcribing every F word and every bit of colorful dialogue that I heard on the ice. And I wrote it once, and it sold. Like, there was just a ton of interest in it, and so I built a column out of it, and I hit it every week, and every week it sold. Every week there was interest in it. And then I started taking what I was hearing and building pieces out of it, like player profiles based on how this player sounds on the ice, game stories based on, like, this team's arrogant, they were doing these things, or this team is too quiet as a group, I don't think they're keeping their energy up in an empty building. And then you go about insisting that what you have access to that no one else does matters, right? Like, no, you're missing the whole story. In rink, it was clear. But it goes back to, I think, a key element that I think distinguishes, the lucky people in our business from the rank and file. Like, you need a ton of luck to get there, and I don't want to understate that. But I also think it's the ability to be dropped in wherever you are dropped into, whatever assignment you're given, whether you're a PR guy, whether you're on the journalist side. Figure out what you see that no one else does, and then be disciplined about hitting that niche and filtering everything through your unique area of expertise. Like, if you played high-level hockey, like, write about that experience. That's something you have that no one else does. If you have experience in drama, if you have experience on television, if you're a social media manager and you can talk at length about, how players and teams use social media. Like, there's so many different angles. Everyone sees the world a little bit differently. And I think being disciplined about telling stories through your unique lens is what can set you apart in sports media, even in a competitive market like Vancouver. And, I think that's something that helped me helped me get through a bubble experience that was a really unique challenge, like helped me make hay or make rotisserie chicken out of chickens, you know. It was sort of being really disciplined about that message. And I think for those of you who are more interested in journalism than media relations, that would be sort of my overwhelming, overarching advice is like, figure out what you can do that no one else can. Do it with discipline and publicly insist on why that way of viewing things is so important. Like that's everything in terms of setting yourself apart.
You literally took the question right out of my mouth. I was going to ask you about Game of Chirps. It was a masterful piece of resourcefulness on your part. And then to bring the conversation back to PR or to loop it in. So did any PR people get upset with you for stuff that you wrote? Because you included swear words that players were saying on the ice.
Not officially.
Okay.
Not officially. Look, I don't think players were all that aware of it. I don't think teams were all that aware of it, to be totally honest with you. I think it was interesting and fun, but I never officially heard from the NHL or any NHL PR people or players themselves about it. I'm sure there was some awareness. I won't be shocked if I'm wrong and I am back in locker rooms again if someone brings it up to me. I have heard from NHL players who loved it. Like I heard from NHL players in the Eastern bubble and from some other NHL players that I talked with who were saying like, I loved hearing all the swears. Like I loved hearing what people were talking about on the ice. Like that was great. So I think people in the industry paid attention, but I heard no negative feedback about it. And, so it goes. I'm sure, I don't know why that is. I honestly, I don't. Like I think there were some things that people thought, is there news value there or is it gratuitous? But, other than sort of friendly chats, I never had a formal complaint or dealt with formal complaint, and neither did my outlet. So for the most part, I think hockey people just kind of understand that hockey people talk like hockey people. And, the way that hockey people talk, it's colorful. Let's put it that way.
All right. I'm going to put you on the spot here. So
let's go.
What do you enjoy more? Being a comms person or being a journalist?
Oh, being a journalist, by far. I liked comms a lot because it's problem solving, but I have an itch to tell stories directly, right? Okay. No matter what I was doing as a comms person, like I was always in a museum, like I was always seeing things through a pane of glass as opposed to directly interacting with them and going elbow deep into the story. Like it was something I was setting up for someone else, but I had to be removed from the actual act of producing it or putting my own spin on it or thinking my way through storytelling problems. So like it was adjacent to what I absolutely love, and adjacent enough that I enjoyed it, but it just wasn't exactly what I love to do, which is to tell stories directly. But again, I do think there were some challenges to telling an organization's story, telling it in a favorable light, telling it through other people, leveraging different communications mechanisms for different messages. Like there was a problem-solving element to it that I found very enjoyable, very challenging in a way that was fun and gratifying. And certainly it hit the sort of social real-time problem solving that I think is your everyday as a journalist and that I really enjoyed. It's your everyday as a comms person too. And I liked that, like the fact that it never really felt like I had a normal job. Like every day was different and I just kind of had to think on my feet and produce good work no matter what. I think both lines of work gave me that. But yeah, my true love is directly telling stories. And as much as I enjoyed PR and comms, I was just a little bit too removed from the thing that's at the absolute core of what I love about my job now.
You know what, just to kind of wrap up here, Thomas, I mean, what I really love about that comment is, I think it's part and parcel to knowing yourself and what your passion is and what drives you. And you can really get a number of different experiences that can ultimately lead back. Who says back where it all begins? Who says you can't go home again? Everything, kind of builds to the next. So I think there's a fascinating point. It's clear from even just your energy over the last 45 minutes spent here, just how passionate you are about storytelling. And maybe when it comes to coming home again, the Where Are They Now Artem Chubarov stories, just begging and dying to be told, just as everything does find a funny way to come full circle. But I mean, I will say this, Thomas, like so many, unique and incredible insights today, and your honesty. I mean, hearing stories about Yager to covering the Panthers to obviously the pitfalls and the, as you mentioned, game of chirps, like this idea of being able to go in the bubble and getting a unique experience. You've certainly had a lot. So hopefully this was one little notch in your belt from a uniqueness. Thomas, thanks for taking the time to join us today. We loved having you.
My absolute pleasure. Anytime, gentlemen.
All right. So listen, on behalf of David and myself, that's it for Office Hours for SportTokz with SportTokz. We'll see you soon.